Senhores, dando continuidade ao nosso evento, nós convidamos o nosso moderador, o professor Augusto Buschweitz, para moderar a nossa terceira mesa da tarde. Teremos agora a palestra Necessário, mas não suficiente, três dimensões da alfabetização inicial. Convidamos, para tanto, a senhora Catherine Snow, de Harvard Graduate School of Education, HGSE, dos Estados Unidos. Com a palavra, o nosso moderador, o professor Augusto.
Ok, muito brevemente, o Renan pediu para que eu substituísse nessa moderação, e então eu vou imediatamente passar a palavra para a doutora Catherine Snow. Dr. Catherine Snow, can you hear me? You may start, as you please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Muito obrigada. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to use modern technology to address you. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but I guess this is better than nothing. And what I'd like to talk about is a comprehensive approach to early literacy instruction, and bring a few warnings or lessons from the history of efforts in the United States to engage in wide-scale literacy reforms. So the basic claim here is that there are three crucial dimensions to effective early literacy instruction. Each of these is as important as the other. Children need the motivation to become literate. They need to understand what being literate is all about. They need the opportunity to develop broad and deep language skills, because language is ultimately the foundation for literacy. And they need the opportunity to grasp and master the alphabetic principle. Enough instruction and enough practice that they know how letters and sounds relate to one another. The challenge that we have experienced in the States is that there has been a persistent swinging of a pendulum back and forth from a focus on teaching the code, focusing almost exclusively on the alphabetic principle, to a focus on teaching for meaning. Less attention, insufficient attention to teaching the code. And that pendulum has gone back and forth over the years to, I would argue, the detriment of the children who are trying to learn to read. They get buffeted back and forth because the pendulum is almost always at one extreme or the other. Whereas, in fact, of course, teaching code and teaching for meaning are equally important, and we need to figure out how to do both at once. So let me talk for a minute about this one dimension of the crucial, necessary but not sufficient dimensions, the opportunity to grasp and master the alphabetic principle. Grasping the alphabetic principle means recognizing that letters represent sounds, that there is a systematic way in which sounds and letters are related to one another. The insight of the nature of the alphabet. And grasping that is, of course, a prerequisite. Then students often need a fair amount of practice to master the alphabetic principle as well, to become automatic in making the connection from letters to sounds, or from sounds to letters when writing and spelling. That's very important. But one danger is that it can be taught in a way that reduces the motivation to be literate. If we focus too much on how letters relate to sounds, we might lose track of the whole reason we're teaching students that skill, namely that they want to access meaning, that literacy should be fun and enjoyable, and a way of opening up a wider world for them. In that respect, then, the opportunity to develop broad and deep language skills is really absolutely crucial and very, very large part of the early instructional program, or at least it should be. It should not be crowded out by the focus on the alphabetic principle. And the opportunity to develop language skills that are both broad, a large vocabulary, for example, but also deep, some sophistication in certain language tasks. That opportunity goes hand in glove with motivation, because this is where we can reassure students that the reason they're reading is to learn and to enjoy themselves. So that's actually my fairly simple message, and I considered at this point perhaps doing an extensive review of this claim that broad and deep language skills predict long-term reading outcomes very effectively. But there's so much literature that research that supports that claim that it was daunting to even think about what to talk about. So I decided instead to think about and present to you some of the history of literacy reforms in the United States and how those have swung back and forth from a focus on the alphabetic principle to a focus on language, and in every single case have gone too far one way or the other. This is what we want, right? We want that pendulum right in the middle, with room for alphabetic principle and language skills in our instructional program. And achieving that is, of course, a challenge, but it's a challenge that is made much harder if we continue to engage in battles with one another about code versus meaning, when in fact both code and meaning are crucially important. The one very influential and by now quite historical view of reading development is referred to as the simple view of reading. This was introduced in the 80s by Phil Goff and Bill Tunmer. And it was this rather straightforward claim that reading comprehension, understanding what you're reading, is a product of decoding and oral comprehension skills. And this was a clarifying conceptualization for many in the reading field, because it seemed to overcome this dichotomy of decoding versus meaning. But the instructional implications that were drawn from the simple view of reading were in some cases as extreme as those implications that had preceded. Namely, simple view of reading is a product of decoding and oral comprehension. So we have to teach phonics because children develop oral comprehension naturally. So what schools should do is focus on decoding. Or in other places, in other school districts, we have to teach more vocabulary because vocabulary is the contribution to oral comprehension. And we shouldn't be spending our time focused on decoding. Both of those implications were, of course, too extreme, and they led to this pendulum swing back and forth from meaning to code to meaning to code. That's the pendulum swing that we need to slow down and stop. So let me step back for a minute and just make clear that my perspective here is primarily informed by the history of reading and reading policy in the US. And it's thus, obviously, strongly influenced by the challenges of reading English, which creates more obstacles to decoding than a language like Portuguese. And also by the history of literacy reform movements in the US. And there have been a lot of them because people are persistently dissatisfied with the levels of reading that children achieve. So I'll show you some historical data here. In the US, we do every few years an assessment called the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And this particular graph shows you, starting from 1992 through 2017, 25 years of performance on the NAEP. And you'll see it's on average pretty flat, right? It went up a little bit from 98 to 2007, but basically only a couple of points, not enough to make much difference in a educational sense. So the history has been kids read this well. A lot of them are reading at a level that's below proficient. On average, they're reading at a level that's below proficient. And that's a very stable outcome. And here is that same graph annotated with the points at which various important national reports have been produced that you might think would have influenced the curve, might have signaled a point of improvement in reading outcomes. So I'm going to talk about each of these and talk about why, despite all of this attention to national reading reports, why they actually haven't evidently had much impact on students' reading outcomes. Here's the NAEP scores for 8th grade, and you'll see actually pretty much the same picture. Students on average reading at a below proficient level, and not much change over the years since 1992. The first important national report in the US was A Nation at Risk that was published in 1983 and that addressed the huge social and economic disparities in reading outcomes. The report pointed to the fact that we actually know how to teach children to read, but that very many were failing in that effort. And it aroused a lot of anxiety in the American educational establishment with consequences for what was going on in the schools. Many states introduced accountability testing as a result of A Nation at Risk. That is to say, they decided that they would really figure out within their state how well students were reading, and they would make those tests rather hard in order to promote more attention to reading instruction in the schools. At the same time, new instructional materials were developed, but these were focused on promoting test results. In other words, the power of the assessment system started to become quite great during this immediate post-Nation at Risk period. Several years later, the American National Academy of Sciences decided that the reading wars, which were very, very powerful in the US at that point, there were folks promoting whole language reading, and there were folks promoting very explicit phonics instruction. And they were arguing with one another in a way that undermined the credibility of education research, and that undermined the likelihood that parents would believe what their children's teachers were telling them. So this report was actually designed to resolve the reading wars, to review the literature comprehensively, and to tell the nation what should be going on in first and second and third grade classrooms in order to prevent the emergence of poor reading in young children. The report recommended that all children have opportunities for 5 key domains of learning. Opportunities to ensure motivation and positive affect around reading. In other words, we know that young children, or for that matter, older children and adults, don't learn unless they're motivated to learn, and that the report argued too little attention had been paid to ensuring motivation in early reading instruction. The opportunity to develop rich language skills, the opportunity to grasp and master the alphabetic principle, access to supports for literacy at home as well as at school. In other words, a more societal involvement in supporting literacy, and starting much earlier than school. Thinking about literacy development in the preschool period, in infancy even. And then finally, opportunities to be assessed so that we could identify children who were beginning to lag behind, and so we could give them remediation immediately rather than waiting for them to fail. So regular tracking of children's growth so that interventions could be provided very quickly. That was a fairly uncontroversial set of recommendations, you might think. And it had consequences, some good consequences, I think, for a few years. The role of parents and child care providers and the broader community was emphasized, so they became involved in programs like Reach Out and Read that gave books to infants visiting well care providers and so forth, were very much strengthened by this report. There was greater recognition of the role of language development in preschool and the importance of attending to language in the primary school years. Pedagogical attention to motivation was enhanced, and programs that taught explicit phonics were validated because the research reviewed supported their value. And the needs of classroom teachers, of primary grades teachers for support with struggling readers was recognized, rather than just assuming that whole class instruction would work for everyone, that it was the teacher's fault if children were having difficulties learning to read. The recognition was promoted that we needed reading specialists and we needed reading coaches, and that differentiated instruction was crucial in first and second grade. So I would say those were non-controversial recommendations, but there was concern among some, and this is the pendulum coming back in again, that there was not sufficient attention in those recommendations to the need for phonological awareness and phonics instruction. And that conclusion was drawn, I think, only because there was also quite a lot of attention to motivation and language, and it was thought that the focus on phonological awareness and phonics was weakened by that. So, as a result, another national report was commissioned, the National Reading Panel, which reviewed pretty much the same territory of research as the Preventing Reading Difficulties report, but it focused on identifying and summarizing experimental and quasi-experimental literature. So a different methodological approach. The hope was that the National Reading Panel report would validate scientifically based programs, would be able to recommend to schools and teachers and school districts programs that had a strong scientific basis. And as you probably all know, the National Reading Panel ended up finding evidence for 5 proven practices: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency practice, vocabulary instruction, and reading comprehension strategy instruction. And it's worth noting that phonological awareness and phonics were, the database for those was in K through 2nd grade. For fluency, 2nd through 5th grade. For vocabulary and reading comprehension, most of the literature available started in 4th grade and went up into the secondary grades. So these have been presented as 5 pillars, but in fact, for the primary grades, for kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, the real consequences were much more focused on phonological awareness and phonics. And this is a reinterpretation of the National Reading Panel report that puts text comprehension at a higher level and as a more important outcome, supported by attention to the other 4 pillars. So what happened after the National Reading Panel report? Well, not the report itself, but a far-reaching policy initiative that was based in the report, No Child Left Behind, created a very much enhanced accountability system focused on reading and math. All states had to design tests to be given to all students with guidelines for how much progress students were meant to make every year, and schools, how quickly schools needed to get all students up to acceptable levels of performance. And that accountability system is officially still in place, but it has degraded by virtue of its own, the impossibility of the goals that were established within it. At the same time, the No Child Left Behind legislation created the Early Reading First project, which involved a lot of funds, a lot of money made available to states to give to schools serving low-income children. But it tied access to the funds to specific curricula and to specific pedagogical approaches in the primary grades, and mandated 120 to 180 minutes of literacy instruction. Clearly the test of the Early Reading First was going to be the students' performance in 3rd grade state accountability assessments. That fact encouraged teachers and schools to do a lot of assessments in first grade and 2nd grade as well, using dibbles and other measures of word reading primarily. The explicit goal was the very valid one of increasing classroom teachers' use of research-based instructional practices and providing more support for teachers through professional development and coaching and supplemental interventions. And literacy programs received a lot of extra funding, grounded in the National Reading Report findings. Scientifically based reading research, defined by the National Reading Panel, was successfully implemented in lots of schools receiving national funding, and literacy coaching was greatly enhanced. And there was a big evaluation study, the Reading First Impact Study, to see whether these various measures worked. So the focus of the Reading First legislation was new reading curricula and materials, professional development and coaching, diagnosis and prevention of early reading difficulties. And People complained a lot about this. It was characterized as a continuation of the policies first introduced by A Nation at Risk, focusing far too much, according to the critics, on assessments that narrowed expectations, that encouraged teachers to teach to the test rather than teaching in ways that would value intellectual curiosity, cooperative learning, projects, field trips, and so forth. One colleague of mine characterized the impact of the national, of the No Child Left Behind approach as doing a better job of teaching kids to read and stripping from them any reason why they would want to read. That is perhaps a little harsh, but it does speak to this fact that it's very easy to move the pendulum way too far toward one side or the other if we don't think about all of the necessary but not sufficient components of good reading instruction. The Reading First Impact Study, a very large evaluation of the impact of Reading First in the districts where it was implemented, found that indeed amount of time spent on reading instruction increased. So on average, 120 to 150 minutes a day was in first grade and second grade was spent on reading instruction. However, although students' word reading scores increased in some cases, there was no evidence that their reading comprehension was improved by this instruction. There were a lot of changes in teachers' instructional practices, and students' reading achievement did improve in some sites, the sites that received the money very late in the process, perhaps because those were the sites with less disadvantaged children in them to begin with. And it's clear that the Reading First program did make literacy instruction more coherent. In other words, it was an opportunity to give all the first grade teachers in a district the same kind of professional development. And that increased similarity of what they were doing across different schools with positive consequences for them and for their students. But here we are, Reading First Impact Study, No Child Left Behind, Reading First Impact Study. Nonetheless, the trends in the fourth grade NAEP remain pretty flat. Unfortunately, the battle about how much should we teach phonics, how much should we focus on meaning continues. And many schools and districts in the US have now reverted to the use of curricular approaches that pay almost no attention to phonics, while others are still spending 60 or 70 minutes a day teaching about the alphabetic principle. Both of those constitute educational malpractice. Enough so that the International Literacy Association in 2019 issued a report, a literacy brief that emphasized the importance of including phonics instruction in an integrated literacy program. And this literacy brief, which just came out a few months ago, again generated a great deal of pushback from various groups of reading educators who felt that focusing too much on phonics instruction would itself be a dangerous thing to do. But ultimately, first grade, second grade, third grade reading instruction has to be evaluated in light of how it contributes to much later reading outcomes. And later reading outcomes are reading comprehension. They're not reading aloud accurately. They're using texts to engage in meaningful activities. And readers have to be prepared with all of the skills to do that, language skills as well as word reading skills as well as discourse comprehension skills, as well as background knowledge, which is quite crucial in predicting outcomes in reading comprehension in the later grades. And one of the great challenges, I think, in designing early reading instruction is to remember that we're really preparing students in first grade and second grade and third grade. We're preparing them to read history and science and novels in the later grades. We're not preparing them to be accurate readers of text out loud. So a bottom line might be quite an elderly quote now from an eminent reading researcher. A guideline for instruction: the optimum amount of phonics instruction a child should be exposed to is the minimum the child needs to become an independent reader, because it is the independent reader who has the opportunity then to acquire language and literacy and advanced literacy skills through autonomous interactions with text. So what I've tried to picture here is the disadvantage of having a pendulum swinging back and forth because of disputes between reading researchers and reading instruction designers, disputes about how much phonics or how much language. The fact of the matter is we need both an appropriate amount of attention to the alphabetic principle and rich and wide-ranging language experiences. But how do we ensure progress based on that conceptualization, implementing what we've learned from research, but without letting any single research study or research on any single domain of reading instruction push us too far in the direction that it recommends? And how do we recruit teachers and parents to embrace guidance from research when researchers can't stop fighting with one another, and without undermining their self-confidence and professional status? Because teachers and parents also have a very important role in the process of ensuring effective literacy instruction. Another question that worries me a lot is whether research knowledge about the multiple facets, the many necessary but not sufficient facets of literacy development, is reflected in teacher education, in what teachers are taught in their pre-service programs, whether it's reflected in professional development, whether it's embedded in the curricular resources we give teachers, and whether it's emphasized in the instructional approaches we advance. Because teachers can't make this up on their own. They need to have the resources of education and professional development that supports their appropriate integration of attention to the many different elements of good reading instruction, and they need to have the curriculum that supports the right integration and the right balance. And then final question: what principles or emphases underlie successful and sustained literacy reform efforts? I would argue that the US experience suggests, first of all, that you can write a great report, you can present what we know from research, and not expect to see an immediate improvement in literacy outcomes. That, in fact, part of what needs to happen is an approach of gradual incremental improvement, spreading these practices slowly enough that they really become second nature in primary classrooms. Quick fixes don't fix. And on the other hand, consistent efforts to change teacher education, to improve professional development, and to provide more supportive curricular resources that will, those three elements will, over the long run, demonstrate positive impacts for children. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Snow. So I'm going to read the question in Portuguese, and then I will read it in English to you right after. We have 3 questions. Eu vou ler as perguntas aqui que vieram no aplicativo e que foram curadas aqui pelo pessoal. Então, a primeira delas é como incluir as 3 dimensões na formação inicial dos professores e como isso foi resolvido nos Estados Unidos. So, Dr. Snow, the first question is, how can the 3 dimensions be included in teacher education? And how is that being addressed in the United States, or how was that addressed in the United States?
I don't think I can suggest that the United States has solved that problem. In some programs, it's addressed, for some teacher education programs, but I believe there are still many teacher education programs in which future teachers are not being provided with an adequate understanding of the process of reading development. But I can say that the issue here is really a question about how children learn to read. It's a exposure to developmental principles, and the developmental principles specific to reading, which are that yes, you have to know how to translate little squiggles on the page into sounds, but you also have to be able to use language in a rich and sophisticated way. So I think that teachers in teacher education need a course in reading development in which that process is made clear. But I think even that will not translate into better classroom practice unless we also provide curricula that do a good job of integrating attention to those 2 dimensions, that we can support teachers much better with curricula that have planned out the appropriate amount of time and attention to different elements in reading development, but that also provide motivating and accessible texts for children to practice with.
Ok, thank you. A próxima pergunta, qual lição aprendida com No Child Left Behind que se poderia passar para os policymakers brasileiros? So the question is, what lesson can Brazilian policymakers learn from the No Child Left Behind Act? What could you suggest?
I would suggest that one major implication is don't rely on accountability testing as the lever for implementing the reform. That if once tests start to have serious consequences for schools or for children, all kinds of distortions are introduced. I'm not against testing. I think we need to assess how children are reading and how much progress they're making in reading. I think teachers need to know that. I think schools need to know that. But once consequences are attached to those tests, once a school is identified as failing because 60% of the kids in the school don't pass the test, or once kids are held back in grade because they haven't passed the test, then mechanisms will be introduced that distort the process of education. Teachers will start teaching to the test, and that means they will not be teaching in a way that we would all recognize as optimal. They will not be taking time to let kids be creative and engage in projects and learn about authentic literacy experiences. So I think we have to be very cautious with accountability testing. I think it's also, another more positive lesson is that investing a lot of money and time and energy in professional development can pay off, and that one of the payoffs of that investment is ensuring that teachers in a school and teachers within a district are working in ways that are similar, that there's a coherence to the literacy instructional program that comes from what they've learned in shared professional development sessions. And that makes life much easier for them because they have professional colleagues they can talk to. And it makes it easier for students because it means if they switch schools, they recognize what's going on. They're not going from one school that's all focused on teaching the code to another school that's all focused on giving them texts and letting them figure it out for themselves.
Ok, a próxima pergunta é sobre o Chile e só um comentário aqui da moderação que, lembrando que sexta-feira o professor Christian Cox, que participou da reforma chilena, estará aqui na CONABE. So the next question is about Chile, and I was just letting our audience know that on Friday, Christian Cox, who participated in the Chilean reform, will be here. The question is, in Chile, there's the evaluation of the process of the work that the teacher does as part of public policy and not just performance. And then what did you do? I think the you here refers to the US, I guess. A pergunta é, no Chile temos a avaliação do processo do trabalho do professor como parte da política pública e não do desempenho do aluno como no Brasil, como vocês fizeram, e aí eu interpretei que vocês aqui se refere aos Estados Unidos. So you, I guess, would be the US.
So I think that's a very promising approach that Chileans have adopted. That process it's of course quite labor intensive and expensive to focus on process rather than product, but it's ultimately much more informative. That approach has been taken in the US in some places. In early childhood education, it has been implemented quite widely using the class to evaluate processes in the classrooms, the instruction, the quality of instructional support, the quality of emotional support, and the quality of sort of classroom organization, which are really process variables. And that works well in early childhood. The class is used in elementary schools as well. But the importance of the class in elementary schools is kind of overwhelmed by the attention starting in third grade to the test scores. So you could look, a teacher could have very high scores on a class evaluation, but if her students don't all pass the test, then those high scores don't do her any good. So I think that a better balance between attention to the process and the outcome would be a big improvement in the US. It's what we see in early childhood because we're not testing children all the time yet in preschool, kindergarten, and but we start doing the testing in first grade.
Ok, thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Salva de palmas.
Thank you.
Oi? So thank you, Dr. Catherine Snow. Hannah is here telling me to thank you, and I'm just following orders. Thank you for an enlightening presentation and for discussing with us. We hope to have you with us at another opportunity in the future.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy your evening.